Call this meeting to order. December 9th, Planning and Zoning Commission. Can we have the roll call, please?
Andre Spinelli.
Here.
Jared Gardner.
Here.
Jim Winchester.
Here.
Scott Pullis.
Here.
Jeff Runn.
Here.
Daniel George.
Here.
Greg Strike. Here. Radhika Krishna and Brandy Eber are excused. You have a quorum. Thank you.
The first order of business will be a motion to amend the agenda to add 2 informational memorandums to the agenda. Item J, Title 21 discussion. Moved by Commissioner Strike, seconded by Commissioner Gardner. Is there any discussion on that motion? Any opposed? Hearing, seeing none, the motion passes. Are there any disclosures from the commissioners? See no disclosures. We'll move on to unfinished business. The public hearing in this case, 2024-0124 has been closed. Does staff have anything new to present?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have a quick presentation, if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. You'll find in the packet that in the memo dated December 9th, PCC case 2024-0124, we provided some information in response to some of your questions from the November 18th, 2024 meeting. We'll be glad to speak to any of those if you have additional questions. And I'll just kind of go through a presentation I kind of gave to the CEDC last week, going into some of that, looking at a different data set that we found. So again, special limitations can do one or more of the following: limit density, prohibit structures, uses of land, require compliance with design standards, require compliance with the site plan approved under this title, and require construction and installation of improvements, and impose time limits for subsequent development actions. So since the last meeting, I've gone in and I looked at where we have on the zoning map a list of all the SLs. I think that's the most current source of information. So just looking in that, I was able to pull that out and see how many we have. It's about the same as what we, I think, saw before, B3SL, most of the SLs. Many types of SLs have now been incorporated into 21. I think we talked about this a little bit last time, that over time we've seen the types of rules that appear in SLs get incorporated into the code. Count of SLs based on decade, we had about 79 unknown, but again, the 1980s saw the most at 131, and then slowly we've seen fewer and fewer SLs over time. Again, most likely because a lot of those rules have gotten folded into the code. So since the last meeting, I've gone through a lot more of them. I think there are about between 300 and 400 SLs. I think I've read about probably 350 of them, sort of just lightly looking at what they include, what kind of things they cover. There's references to code sections which no longer exist. Actually, let me step back a moment. These are some of the issues that I've seen coming up so far with the existing SLs. Sometimes they refer to code sections that don't exist anymore. Sometimes they result in split lot zoning. Sometimes they have really variable lists of what's allowed or not allowed. For example, sometimes they'll say the following 10 uses are allowed, or the following 25 uses are not allowed. So it kind of makes it difficult to assume which way one's going or not. There are case-by-case stipulations, complicated ways of measuring restrictions. There's one that says there's no new structure shall be higher than the highest point of the existing structure on the property, which of course could change. And you know, if the wind like tonight blows something down, that could change the entire entitlement for the property. There's another one that says building height shall not exceed the lesser of 35 feet or a maximum of 138 feet above mean sea level based on the GAAB 1972 post-quake adjustment. Again, these are standards that I don't think we use that much anymore in the planning department, basing a height off of a mean sea level. Very specific rules which require interpretation. one, for example, says you have to develop at a minimum of 2 dwellings per acre and a maximum of 3. References to plans which may not be in force anymore. There's one that says you have to refer to the Spenard District Commercial Strategy, Spenard Commercial District Development Strategy from 2003, and again, I think that's probably been superseded by the Spenard Corridor Plan by now, but the AO doesn't reflect that. References to zoning districts that no longer exist. There's at least one or two that refer to an R2 zone, which today, I think at some point became an R2M, so that just adds another layer of complication where somebody says, oh, my SL applies to R2, R2 doesn't exist anymore, or R2 converted to R2M in most cases, I'm assuming. And then a very long process to make simple amendments. So finding one where, one SL said 30 units are allowed on this property or on this tract or in this district, and then to get it up to 32, they had to go back through the rezone process. There's another that limited all the uses, and then in 1990 they had to allow a single additional use in churches and synagogues. So they had to go through that whole process just to allow one more use. There are many examples of SLs being used to limit housing production basically throughout most of the time they've been in existence. Here's page 1. I showed this at CEDC. Here's another page I found since then. Sometimes it says explicitly you can't have above a certain density. Sometimes it says you can't have more than a certain number of units for the whole tract. Sometimes it limits it by lot size and say you can't have a lot size larger than this, or smaller than this. And sometimes it just, in this one, it's a B3 zone, which does allow housing, and it says the uses should be limited to parking and to 3,000 square foot accessory structure. So that's also limiting the potential capacity for housing for that lot, but doing it in a sort of roundabout way. A lot of SLs have also been used to limit specific types of housing. A lot of prohibitions on manufactured housing communities. Interestingly, some, they show up in these lists of other uses like resource extraction, mining or impound yards, motorized sports. There's one, it kind of groups them in with adult businesses, but also boarding houses and lodging houses. And then this one, I'm sorry, you can't see very well, but also limiting multifamily. So there are a lot of times where it either limits the density of housing or just limits certain types of housing altogether. On November 26th, we talked to the Geotechnical Advisory Commission. That recording is available online. You can listen to the whole thing. It's a very interesting discussion. GAC didn't take any action on the item. We didn't have anything prepared or weren't expecting it. And one thing they asked is if the GAC has ever been involved in the creation of SLs related to slope. We couldn't find any evidence that they had. Several of the members have been on the GAC for a few years, not the whole time, and they were going to look into see if anybody knew if that happened. But for now, it seems like the GAC hasn't really been involved in SLs related to slope or health safety. And they recognize that some SLs are now covered by code, but they didn't do a comprehensive analysis, right? We asked them to say, well, if presuming everything went away, do you see any health safety risk? And their take, and check me on this, you can listen to the recording, was kind of, well, we don't want to take them away, but without knowing what they're covering, right? But so far, the general agreement was sort of that it seems that a lot of this stuff is covered now in Title 21. There's a lot about slopes and slopes above a certain percentage, and also in Title 23 in the building code. And another thing that the commission asked is how many SLs are in seismic zones or avalanche zones. And we, in looking, just if you look at the map, you don't see a lot of strong correlation between where the SLs, most of the SLs are, and where the seismic zones are, where the avalanche zones are. Avalanche, I think the avalanche controls in the code maybe have gone beyond what the SLs ever imagined. So anyway, again, that's November 26, 2024. The recording is available. It was a great discussion, and we're thankful to the GAC. It's honestly really fantastic to have a group of experts like that to refer a question like this to. Any questions?
Commissioner Ron.
Thank you. Commendation to staff for responding to the questions that were asked during the meeting in which the commission heard this case. On the last page of what was provided to the commission, a statement around middle paragraph, all the SLs the department has reviewed so far could have been applied through normal departmental reviews, plat notes, effective clauses, or private covenants if desired. I interpret that to mean that other tools exist to effectively accomplish the intention, to the extent that we understand it, what the SLs can be used for now. My question is around when SLs enter the process. How are they put into effect? Can you speak to the commission about that, please?
Yes, through the chair. I can't speak to every SL because a lot of that I think it lives in the minutes and we haven't gone through all the minutes. But from what I've seen, SLs can either come through when the applicant comes to the Planning and Zoning Commission. They can come from the municipality in some way, they can come from the commission in some way, and they can come from the assembly in some way. And I think each one is different. There are a number of SLs where you look at the original application and they're asking for sort of a straight rezone from R1 to R2M. And then when you see it's gotten to the Planning and Zoning Commission, it's now an R2M SL or at the assembly level. So I don't think they always come from in the same way. Again, going back to our previous discussion, to me it seems like SLs have been a tool where if sort of pressure comes up in the process, they've been a tool that's been used to relieve that pressure. And so in relation to your other comment about the other tools available, I think maybe it would, if there might be other points to relieve that pressure or other times when that could be, those sort of conditions or changes could be put in place.
If I could follow up just on that point. So heard in the response that this commission has under current code and the allowances of special limitations the ability to apply those special limitations. I'm trying to overlay that on these other tools in the toolbox and see how that relates to either expanding, keeping the same, or decreasing the role of this commission with respect to, again, the intention of what this is all getting at. So let's say SLs go away. What does that mean to this commission and our ability to address pain points that we see come before us?
Through the chair, thank you for the follow-up because it helped me clarify. I think it is important to note that from my understanding that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommends the SLs to be added on to the rezone, whereas other stuff like a plat note would be sort of imposed on it by the platting board or given that power would exist in that way. And so if this AO went through, then the Planning and Zoning Commission wouldn't no longer, or they could make that recommendation, or actually I'd have to look exactly, but let's say that the language of the AO says you can no longer make the recommendation. My understanding is that the Planning and Zoning Commission as a body that makes recommendations to the Assembly can always make all sorts of recommendations. I don't think your power to make a recommendation would be limited. Maybe it would just be that the power to make that specific type of recommendation for that specific tool would be limited. I don't know if, yeah. I think
that answers the question. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
I guess, can I follow up on that question real quick? Assuming we change Title 21 and the mechanism within Title 21 is no longer there for P&Z to make recommendations of a rezone to the Assembly, the Assembly ultimately creates every rezone through an ordinance. The Assembly could still do an SL if they wanted to, regardless of having that mechanism in Title 21 or not. Is that correct? And that might be like a question for legal, but if you guys happen to know, it's just kind of something interesting that I thought of during Commissioner Ron's question.
Through the chair, I believe that would be a question for legal because the Assembly as a legislative body is empowered to create legislation. However, this would be removing that specific tool and that specific formula for adding limitations to a normal rezone. So supposedly, if this AO passed, my assumption would be that that tool would no longer be available, and whatever restrictions the assembly decided to add after that point would be a creative use of zoning and not regulated by Title 21. Hopefully that helped.
Yeah, thank you. We'll go to Commissioner George.
Thank you to the chair. I appreciate the chair bringing up that point. I too have come to the conclusion that I think that's accurate, that I have a copy of AO 2024-99, at least as introduced, and the applicable section says, rezoning with special limitations, page 305, pursuant to the subsection, the Department and Planning and Zoning Commission shall not recommend, nor should the Assembly approve the imposition of special limitations as part of a proposed rezone. So the way I interpret this, and I would be happy to be set correct if I'm not, is that we would be prohibited from recommending an SL, which we don't enact. The Assembly does, as you correctly pointed out. But the Assembly continues to retain those powers. They're granted by the state constitution and Title 29 of our state statutes, their ability to enact zoning ordinances. I mean, they can't give away their own power. They could simply just pass another AO, is my understanding, to give that power back to themselves in a specific instance. Also on Commissioner Ron's point, I appreciate digging down into the nuance of when these SLs might come up in the process. We say an applicant or a petitioner comes forward and the body decides that an SL might be something pertinent to discuss. If we have other tools available to us, as has been stated in the memo, plat notes, private covenants, those sorts of things, I don't believe we can dictate private covenants. And a plat note probably would most appropriately be dealt with by the platting board, though it may require an additional platting application or fee of some kind if that kind of action is to be taken up. So I don't know that I would feel comfortable having my only pressure relief valve, I think was the metaphor used in the last presentation, to send it to the platting board. I like having the ability to make recommendations to the Assembly, and I think that's what it comes down to. I think it's just a matter of process. And then lastly, just to follow up on the presentation, one of the items on the SLs dealt with manufactured home communities and mobile homes, and you talked about how Title 21 has evolved over the years to no longer address or to encompass many of the concerns. Is it correct that in Anchorage, additional manufactured home communities can no longer be established?
Through the chair, manufactured home communities are conditional use in a number of zones, but it has gotten more difficult over time to do it. There are a lot of additional requirements for that specific use type, and it's only a conditional use in certain areas, and it's got a minimum acreage. So it's pretty limited in the code already to put in a new mobile home park. And actually, we just finished a study. We contracted a study to look at that, and that'll be coming out in the next couple months. But the study did find that it's very difficult to do it, and they recommended some changes to that to facilitate more of that housing type. But yeah, right now, and I don't think a new mobile home park has been created in several decades. And this is something that was called out in the 2040 plan as something that, we need to sort of preserve this or deal with, or provide similar opportunities for that level of housing, and in the 2020 plan, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. Through the chair, I thought I had read in the news recently that the Mat-Su Borough had passed an ordinance of some kind that restricted the future creation of manufactured home communities. And so I didn't know that we still had the ability to establish new ones here in Anchorage. Thank you.
Commissioner Gardner.
Thank you. And thank you, staff, as well, as Commissioner Ron mentioned, for the effort to kind of respond to our questions. It's really helpful to have this additional information. My question at the moment is with respect to kind of this notion of tools in the toolbox for the relief valve. And this may have been covered last time around when we talked about this. I don't see it discussed in detail here in this most recent packet, so apologies if this is retreading some ground. But what is the planning department's view on the availability of conditions of approval for rezones? I know that in the AO and I think for the rezone criteria, it's not specifically listed as an option, but I think where it's introduced in Title 21, it's kind of treated as like a generally applicable option. So is that a tool that's in the box for rezones?
Through the chair, thank you for that. That was a good question, and we looked into that. And that's something that we also want to bring to the Assembly when we put forward our Assembly information memo, that there are these stipulations, conditions, and other effective clauses that need to be looked at. I think, from my understanding, a condition of approval is sort of a one-time thing that has to be done before the rezone can go into effect. Maybe it could be something like, well, you know, it's usually go to the state recorder's office, do this. I don't know how far you can go with that before it becomes a sort of contract zoning, for example, to say, well, this becomes effective as soon as you demolish that building or something like that. So that looks to be a tool because it's mentioned, conditions are mentioned in the code. I think we maybe don't have a totally clear answer on the limitations of that tool at the moment, or it needs a legal opinion.
Okay, and I guess just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, the conditions as kind of a one-time thing, we're talking about conditions of approval, not effective clauses? Or maybe there's some overlap between the two of them, potentially, clearly.
Through the chair, yeah, I think there's some overlap, and you've identified and some aren't, they're really not clearly defined, so it is. I think in practice, people might be able to tell you, but when you really pour into it, it's tough to say.
Commissioner Pullis.
Yeah, I'll just echo that I pretty much agree with all the other commissioners' statements. I think, you know, the conditions of approval seems like a tool that we could apply often, but I didn't think about the fact that maybe sometimes we can't apply it under certain conditions, so that's a good point right there. I would just wanted to walk through like a situation that was in this memo today on page 5, where we point out that improvements might be prohibitively burdensome. I kind of agree. Sometimes things are prohibitively burdensome, but in this one, I think I sniffed out, this is Tacot New Mall, and basically we put the cost of intersection improvements and roadway improvements on a giant developer that can pay for that where the municipality couldn't. In today's, you know, planning department, building department world, how would that work out? Is it just traffic recommends that because of the TIA, and then it's made as a requirement in the building permit? How does that work today? That's my question.
Through the chair, we've had this discussion a lot, looking at where traffic gets their authority to impose the sort of cost. And I think in modern code today, it's generally that traffic controls where a property can access the street, so they only make an approval based on the conditions that they set for that sort of thing. So they say, okay, we'll grant you the connection to the right-of-way here and here, but only if you do the following improvements. And that's, I think, where that piece of you have to develop, you know, improve the entire street, you have to put an intersection, you have to put in the stoplight. That's the way that works now, and generally they do have that. So I think that would come through when the development process, when it goes through the round of reviews, that is traffic's comment that holds up the permit until that condition is satisfied.
So in Title 21, there's nothing that says the traffic has the ability to make you do roadway improvements if they say so? I mean, that's my only question, is are we eliminating, you know, specific stuff that keeps the municipality from having to pay for it?
Through the chair, this ordinance would just eliminate the ability to create SLs, but it doesn't change any of the sections of code that traffic uses in, I think it's 2107, to get those sort of, those improvements out of it. So it doesn't touch any of the existing procedures that they use. I'm going to look, and because we've looked at it, there's just like one paragraph that says you can only do this once you've satisfied the needs of the traffic department, but this AO doesn't touch that section.
Thank you.
I would just follow up with, have you ever seen an SL that required off-site improvements? Because that's kind of rare. Okay. Okay, Commissioner Gardner.
Thank you. Just, I guess, two things. A quick follow-up on the conditions of approval. I am looking at, just for reference, 2103.030M.3, and it says, unless there's a time schedule stated as part of the approval or conditions of approval, all conditions of approval shall be met within 1 year of the date of approval unless the condition is ongoing, such as the specification of hours of operation. So it seems like, at least in some contexts, conditions of approval in Title 21 are contemplated as kind of an ongoing restriction. And I guess through that lens, and I'll just, one of the concerns that I have with this proposal, and I get for the folks that deal with SLs, that they're just a nightmare in the way that they've been put together, create a lot of problems. It seems like, just looking at the history of when they've been implemented, that a lot of the updates to Title 21 have reduced dramatically the need for SLs as a kind of release valve. But I don't know that you'll ever get to the point where a generalized planning document will always be able to account for like all of the specific on-the-ground situations, right, that you might encounter. And so I am interested in finding options that provide a little bit of flexibility where it's appropriate. And I read the approval criteria too as contemplating that. I know you're proposing an amendment to criteria 7 there that previously referenced stipulations. But I think criteria 6 also reference, or at least contemplates, the notion of mitigating potential adverse impacts. And I think inherent in that is some notion of some way to do that. And I'm exploring the idea of conditions of approval as kind of one way to do that. But I guess my question is, if that's a possibility, to what degree do conditions of approval just create the same problems that we've seen with SLs, right? And so how are conditions of approval tracked? What mechanisms are available to understand what conditions of approval are applicable to a site if there is one that extends beyond the default 1-year period?
Through the chair, I think you've highlighted an issue, right? Whether it's a condition or stipulation. If it becomes something that can't be accessed in the normal way, it's more likely to be lost or forgotten, or it's more likely to lead to issues of noncompliance, inadvertent noncompliance. I think as we've gone through this, looking at it, it's not just that it's kind of frustrating to implement, it's also an issue of sort of the consistency of the code overall as a set of regulations that's transparent and consistent every time. So if there's an issue of mitigating adverse impacts, and a zoning district, for example, allows a use that might have some sort of adverse impact, I think one way to look at that is, well, maybe that use needs a use-specific standard within the zone. So every time the same problem comes up, people who don't have the wherewithal maybe to go through the process to get it through, or get the SLs, or the surrounding area that needs those protections, so everybody gets those same equal protections. For example, if somebody, say somebody wants to rezone to B3, and somebody says, I don't like this particular use in B3, so we're going to approve it, but a B3 with an SL. And so that, maybe protects the area against some adverse impact. But it's only that area now that gets that special protection from B3. So the bigger question might be, if there is something, and if there are adverse impacts that aren't dealt with in the zoning code and in the use table, perhaps there's a better way to address that and really go into it. Another one is gas stations, I think we could pick on. Is a lot of people say, I don't want a gas station near my house. Well, then maybe a gas station shouldn't be a permitted use, maybe it should be a conditional use or an administrative site plan review. And then that sort of builds that sort of release valve into that process. But really, it's just about maintaining a consistent process every time it is consistent. So even a body like this, you could still deal with some of those things and you could apply those conditions, but as a condition of approval and a conditional use, rather than an SL, which is sort of like a condition on top of, the rest of it. So I think that's sort of, it's sort of cracking open a bigger problem that if there are these uses or these zones maybe that aren't appropriate, right? If somebody says, well, I want to rezone into this land use designation, and it says I can use R2M, and people say that really isn't appropriate, then the other thing is, well, maybe that R2M isn't a good implementing zone for that category, or maybe there are pieces in R2M that are causing problems. And so I think from the strict planning perspective, it would be ideal to address those problems within the existing system so that every time somebody goes and interacts with this process, they're doing so in a consistent way. And finally, to bring it all the way back around, because as you mentioned, if there are conditions of approval, then I'm just thinking to find those, you probably have to go back to the resolution or the meeting or the AO, and we're back in the same position. But also, as you pointed out, it says you can do conditions of approval regulating the hours of operation. So that, I think you've highlighted some piece of code where it's not quite clear and it could create some uncertainty. But thank you.
Commissioner Strike.
Yeah, thank you. Didn't we have near that exact example when we were dealing with the homeless shelters in B3? Am I recalling that correctly? There was a whole outcry about this massive rezoning, and all of a sudden homeless shelters were going to be allowed, and it looked like it was a backdoor approach to bringing homeless shelters into areas that wouldn't otherwise have been allowed. And all of a sudden, and it wasn't a not in my backyard, but it was a tool that was being used within the process to acquiesce homeless shelters. But that was a special limitation that was placed. Am I not recalling this entirely correct? And that was the B3 example here. And the other comment I wanted to put out there is we talk about large parcels of land being developed, they're being replatted, they're going down in size, but these special limitations can be put in place for any number of different reasons. A lot of these large tracts, and we used Takotnu Commons as an example, and this is going back, 30 years probably, but I believe that was part of a larger land trade that was used. That was a land swap. And so the access to Elmendorf through this property was something that was conditionally identified to be able to put through. And so therefore, I imagine there was a special limitation placed on that tract of land that the ultimate developer, at whatever point it was feasible to develop, would be required to put the road system in place that not only went to the development, but to the Elmendorf gates. And if you look at it, it also went in and tied into Bartlett High School and went into the Native Heritage Center. So all of this was tied together as part of a land trade. So we got to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I believe some of these special limitations have had a use that goes back to the large tract that we may not see the repercussions of that effect for 20 years when it finally gets developed, but it does happen. And I will point out another piece of property that was off of between Tudor and International, right behind the Hotel Row. There was a road that goes through behind Motel 6 and all these motels, and it stopped. Well, there was a large tract of land, and it was a continuous land that went from C Street all the way back into the St. Elias Hospital. It was replatted. But when it was replatted, the agreement was that the developer was responsible for the utilities and the road construction to put the road through at that point. And in the meantime, as a development, it got reduced property taxes. It got a benefit for not having done it. But the agreement was when it does go in, the developer was required to put the road. That was a special limitation placed on it. And it impacted the value of the property itself. St. Elias, just so edification, St. Elias came forth, went down to Juneau, got a grant from the state, handed the money over to the city, and the city put the road in through a grant money from the state. So all the parties got it for free basically anyway, but the rest of us taxpayers ended up paying for that. But my point is special limitations a lot of times they start on a larger tract of land, and then as it's replatted and comes up forth for development, the true intent of those special limitations become evident. And my last point was 9 special limitations in 2020s. And as noted by another commissioner, they've tapered off significantly since Title 21 has been put into place. And I think you started going through the purpose of some of these 9 that were out there. But it strikes me, no pun intended, that the problem seems to be curing itself. And the problem seems to be older SLs that are out there. And how do we get rid of them? And just to wipe them off, the old SLs off and say they no longer apply. Well, the process for not applying an old SL that no longer applies because the code has been updated or because it doesn't make sense from a statutory or it's in conflict with a statutory requirement, it would seem like an easy mechanism to fix that would just be an administrative action. That doesn't need to come to the assembly, it doesn't need to come to the commission. It seems like some of these fixes can be handled administratively. And I'll close with that.
Does staff have any response to Commissioner Strike's comments? Not quite questions?
So neither of us were involved in, I was just looking up the case on the homeless shelter in B3. I think it was case 2021-0025. I only saw what was on the planning and zoning agenda, but it looked like that was a case to update the use table. So that, in the way we're looking at it, that's going through the process where it's determining whether that's appropriate in that zone or not. So I would say that that's separate from a special limitation. And that's the kind of thing where you can have the broader conversation of, is this appropriate in all B3 zones or not? And I just do want to emphasize that this AO, it doesn't remove SLs. It just kind of blocks the creation of future SLs. And in the sort of that subdivision case, in the plat note discussion we were talking about, that those kind of could be added on there. And then to the final comment about removing through SLs through administrative action, that's beyond what we've been asked to contemplate. The AO did direct the planning department, to initiate a comprehensive review and make recommendations for zones and parcels to be considered in a later ordinance, removing the special limitations. So that might be something that would come out of that process. But in this, we weren't asked to look at that specifically. Thank you. And I'll just emphasize that the current process for removing NSL is a rezone, a full rezone, as if it was to any other zone. Thank you.
Commissioner Ron.
Thank you through the chair. Did I hear staff say that next step from the department would be an information memo to the assembly? If so, could you give us some insight as to what that might include? My assumption is that it would include all of the recommended text changes that we've seen both in the first packet and our last, but if there's anything else in there, I'd be interested to know. Thanks.
Through the chair, it would include anything that happens here tonight and hopefully include some of the questions that you all asked tonight. It'll include, we've kind of responded to a lot of the public comment we've heard anyway, but it'll just include that in a table. And if I could sneak in one more thing for Commissioner George, mobile manufactured housing communities are allowed as a conditional use in R2M, R3, R4, and R4A, and R5. Thank you.
And Commissioner George.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to defer to you procedurally where you want to go with this. I'm not sure. I wanted to make a few more points.
We're making questions of staff, not points.
Okay.
That's technically what we're supposed to be doing.
Fair enough. one of the questions that's been asked previously is how many SLs do we have? When we went, I raised this question last meeting. When we discussed this, I think we had originally thought it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 105. And then last meeting, I think it was over 500. The memo before us, I think, says 394 of them. And we've seen quite a few examples from the hard work the staff has done putting together the presentations for us to give us, the salient examples of what, basically is the crux of the argument. But without seeing how many there are and what they do, it's really hard to make a determination of whether there is utility with these or not. Trying to get to a form of a question, but each of these SLs had a public process, I imagine, that involved public notice and public hearing. Would it be appropriate to remove them all without similar notice to affected property owners?
Through the chair, I'll just note again that this ordinance wouldn't remove any. It would just prevent them from being created in the future. And the Assembly did direct us to, if it does go through, and the next step would be looking at them closely. And I think the Geotechnical Advisory Commission's advice sort of weighed in on this too, is it would be a lot of work to look at each one and make sure that the codes we have today are serving a similar purpose. And to the question about how many there are, you're right, the number has jumped around a bit. The reason for that is that some SLs, they come as one ordinance, but they touch on multiple different zones. And every time you do an SL, really, you're creating a new zone. We mentioned this at the CEDC meeting, but we say that Anchorage has 15 or some zones. But if you add in all the SLs, we have like 300 zones, right? Like I think R1 and R1A aren't very different in terms of zone. They just have a lot size difference. You can have 10 B3 SLs that are much more different than the difference between R1 and R1A. So that's one of the reasons that we see that it's kind of hard to give a number, because you might have one AO that touches on 4 zones. And so does that count as one SL or multiple SLs? Then there's another one, it's up by the Glen Highway. The first one's from 1979. It says you can't have residential here, you can have this, 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 and this. And then in 1990, they amended it to say you can also have a church and a synagogue. So that's another one. Is that one or two? Because most of the content is in that first SL and the other is in the second. So the reason why we're giving you a variety of numbers is the first one we had a list that said it was counting every single zone as a different SL. So wow, we have 500 or something. And then we went down and we said, we actually don't have that many. And now looking at the internal GIS, I would say we have around 300 or 400. But we still, I think, haven't come down on, well, is one AO, one SL, or is it multiple SLs? So that's the reason for that.
Thank you. This whole process reminds me of something I encountered years ago working as a legislative staffer for the House Finance Committee in Juneau. In state statute, legislatures over the years had added tax credits, revenue expenditures, foregone revenue, whatever you want to call it, and they never expired. And they just piled up, and so no one knew how much money the state was giving out each year or not collecting because it never came in the door. And so what the decision that the legislature came to was to create a sunset, an automatic sunset for all revenue expenditures, and to have a commission create a report to identify them all and to start a sunset cycle of 8 years or however many it was, and to review them and make recommendations to the legislature to keep or repeal them. Maybe an accounting of all of the SLs, which ones are no longer applicable, no longer have utility, and which ones are ripe for presentation to the Planning and Zoning Commission might be appropriate. Obviously, there's cost and staff time involved, and so that's a recommendation that we could make to the Assembly. But I think simply quantifying the problem and allowing them to be looked at, when you're dealing with several hundred of them, might be appropriate. Thank you.
Okay. I got a question. So CC&Rs are required in the code in certain areas. Like, say, for example, unit lot subdivisions are required to record a set of homeowners' documents. I don't know if they specifically call them CC&Rs, but I'm just going to call them that for now. So would a condition of approval, would it be reasonable to assume that conditions of approval, like CCNRs or entering into improvement to public place agreements in the instance of improving right-of-ways or making connections, or recording easements through large tracts that grant access in the future, all of those things could be used as conditions of approval in a rezone. Is that correct?
For the reference, the section is 2108-070 that talks about unilot subdivisions, and it says, homeowners zone association with covenants, conditions, restrictions is required for each unilot subdivision in order to ensure the long-term success, maintenance, cohesive appearance, and curb appeal of a small subdivision. I don't think I have a good answer for you. I'll defer, of course, to the director. It might be a legal thing. I'm thinking that because the code here says you have to create CCNRs, but it doesn't specify what the CCNRs are, it's not getting into that gray area of who is holding the contract or who's the contract between. So just saying you have to have a contract that manages these things. I guess if you're asking, can a condition of a rezone say you have to have CCNRs? Looking at this, since the code already says it, or it already has a precedent, it seems to me, but I think would have to be a legal question.
I mean, I guess I'm just trying to get a feel and give everybody a feel for what these conditions of approval could be. And I mean, just like Commissioner Strike's examples, I mean, it sounded like a lot of those things sounded like things that would come out of a plat. And, you know, we may or may not be seeing a plat with a rezone, but the plat would have, you know, requirements. Typically, if you're going to require roads to be built and right-of-ways to be granted, that would be in a plat, not a rezone. And I understand why we want to get rid of SLs, just to eliminate sloppy zoning and out-of-date zoning. I'll go to Commissioner Strike.
I was going to speak to the CCNRs, and this body has, and I've brought up CCNRs in the past over the last 10 years. And what I've been directed by the planning board is that we don't address CCNRs at this body. We don't look at CCNRs. We don't look at the homeowners associations. We don't control. We don't enforce. We are not tied to a homeowners association and their CCNRs at all. It's separate from the zoning. Then it was thrown back here about in the last year that one of the overrides for the ADUs could be the CCNRs. A homeowners association could have CCNRs that would restrict ADUs. And in those cases, those homeowners association rules would override any of the zoning. It's not by right. So that's between the developer and the homeowners, not between the city.
Yeah, well, you're correct that there are neighborhoods like the one surrounding Campbell Lake, for example, that have CCNRs unenforced, but they do say that you will not have an ADU, even though several ADUs exist in that neighborhood. So that's true, but that doesn't stop Title 21 from requiring homeowners documents already. So I would say whoever told you that the city doesn't do anything about it was either in error or was before Title 21 started requiring it.
But the city doesn't enforce the CCNRs.
No, they don't.
And as far as the unenforced CCNRs that various neighborhoods might have, that becomes a community issue. Doesn't make it right, but all it takes is one homeowner, even in an unenforced, to step up.
Yeah, one might argue that the city doesn't enforce Title 21 beyond a permit approval.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions for staff? That being said, is this an actual question? Because we can make all the points we want while we're speaking to the motion? Okay, go ahead.
Just in summary to Commissioner Gardner's question, can we pretty much put condition of approvals on any process, or are there a couple that we can't? I don't think I fully comprehended a response on that one. My fault, not yours.
Through the chair, no, I'll take that one. It is, I didn't give a very comprehensible response, because I think this body has identified that is not quite clear. We were just looking back through a number of AOs on rezones, and it seems like most of the conditions are usually something about it'll automatically expire unless you get written consent for the SL. It's sort of that like procedural stuff. I don't think we can give you a good answer on what the extent of those conditions are without talking to legal counsel. Right? So I apologize. That one is on me.
All right, what is the will of the body? Oh, Commissioner Ron is in the queue. Do you have a question, or?
I do have a question, and it has a question mark at the end. Seeking clarification, pointing the department to proposed language changes in our first staff packet, page 4 of 27. It's on the issue of effective clauses. While I appreciate the department's definition of effective clauses on page 2 of the packet from December 9th, 2024, I just want to test that definition and make sure I understand it, because my bias around effective clause is that it's a very simple statement indicating that, you know, this shall become effective on X date. That's how I'm currently interpreting the language that I'm reading in Title 21. But if you could shed some light on that so that I understand what the department's intent is in adding that effective language, effective clause language to the AO.
Through the chair, we added that, I believe, because there's another stipulation elsewhere in code that says a rezone may be approved with effective clauses. And so that was just adding it in another place so that it was, and it might be that I believe it says the Planning Zoning Commission can add an effective clause, and then the other section is where it says the Assembly can approve with an effective clause. So us adding that in there was to just remove any sort of uncertainty. And that came from, since it already existed, it was just sort of putting it back. So it's at every level of the process. Sorry. Yeah, consistency.
I guess one more question while we're still on the questions. I feel like there was a time in Anchorage where park and sell lots were popping up everywhere. And I'm just curious, when you were going through the SLs, how many of the SLs appeared to limit the outdoor parking of vehicles for park and sell lots? Because I feel like that's the majority of the ones I seem to find.
Park and sell lot, like vehicle storage?
It's kind of like before your time. They used to park a car. You would like rent a spot in a parking lot, and you would sell your own car at this parking lot. And they used to be all over Anchorage. And I feel like there's a lot of SLs regarding outdoor storage of vehicles or parking of vehicles that were a response to the park and sell lots that were popping up all over, because it was a way to make money off of land without doing any improvements whatsoever.
I have gone through a lot of the SLs. I haven't seen a reference to park and sell in any of the minutes, but I haven't gone through all the minutes yet. I have seen a lot of references to vehicle storage, but that didn't pop up as something that seemed to be a big problem. But we're going to do a deeper analysis next month.
Okay, we are ready for a motion if somebody'd like to make one. Commissioner Ron, would you like to state your motion?
I move in case 2024-0124 to recommend to the Anchorage Assembly approval of the removal of special limitations from code due to their varied application and negative impact on development.
Just looking for a second here. That is seconded by Commissioner Gardner. Commissioner Ron, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Chair and fellow commissioners. I appreciate the level of effort that we applied to this case. It's one that wasn't initially destined to come before us. And I think it's, again, thanks to the planning department and their appreciation and understanding for the roles of the various bodies at play here and how to best balance those bodies to effectively achieve solutions that are better for our community. And I think through this process of the public hearing that we had, the department's follow-up to response to our questions, I feel in a good position to support the motion that's on the table. We've heard quite a few comments from the public, many in opposition. Again, those having been responded to by the department in, I think, a very level way. For me, what bears most in this instance of when you talk about removing a tool from the toolbox, why are you doing that and what tools are you left with? I think in many respects, what I've heard through this process is that the framework, the landscape has changed in the time that this tool was first created. And while it's intended to give flexibility to the process, we've heard that there are now other circumstances, the landscape, the framework, Title 21, having changed throughout in a way that, I don't want to say make the need for flexibility obsolete, that's not what I'm getting after here, but at least have provided supplementary tools that can, in effect, continue to enable consideration where consideration should be given. I appreciate the department's intent to improve upon the AO, and I would like, for the record, my support for the department's proposed changes to carry forward in that memorandum that goes to the Assembly. With that, I'll cede the floor and give it to other commissioners. Thanks.
Anyone else wishing to speak to the motion? Commissioner Strike.
Yeah, as point of clarification, the motion as written, does this include the staff's additional language?
That was the intention from my commentary. If it needs to be stated in the motion, we can amend it as such, but otherwise believing that it'll be captured.
I believe it needs to be captured in a motion or amendment to the motion. Because it's only with those additional comments am I somewhat agreeable to moving this forward. Otherwise, I'm going to abstain, not abstention, but I don't like the motion as written. I need that additional staff language.
So maybe you should make a motion to amend, to add that.
This is a motion to amend the current motion to add staff language as presented in our last meeting and the additional language that they've incorporated at this meeting. Something, pardon? I can't hear you. Staff recommendations. To add staff recommendations from prior meeting in this one.
Okay, the motion has been moved and seconded. I see commissioners flipping paper. I will give everybody a second to find out if they agree. Commissioner Strike, would you like to speak to the motion to amend any further?
No, I think that with the amount of discussion we've had, I think it has been the staff's recommendation and recommended input has been invaluable and gives certain clarity to the tool as it's been used, or not, so as we can move forward with this motion, but that's all.
Commissioner Gardner.
Thank you. I guess I'm not really sure how this ultimately gets transmitted to the assembly, and so I guess I'll make some comments about the proposed amendments from staff just to be taken into consideration, and some concerns I have with adopting them wholesale. I do recognize and fully appreciate the perspective that we want to have the code be applied in like a uniform and equitable manner, and that there certainly are occasions which we've seen here through the commission, and I think we've seen too in some of the example special limitations that you've identified, where there's kind of a one-off patch for something that really identifies and reflects a need for broader change in the code, and sometimes that change gets made and sometimes it doesn't. But I'm hesitant to remove entirely the ability to take into consideration conditions that may be unique to a particular piece of property or area. And I'm concerned that some of the proposed changes, I'm looking at page 4 on the original staff packet, could be read to remove all of that discretion, including the ability to consider conditions for approval, by striking the reference to other modifications or modifications. And I'd like to have some, I think it could be valuable to have some generalized language that keeps the possibility for a condition of approval, even if it's not, an indefinite one, but for a period of time, or something that is more targeted. I think through this process, both the commission and the assembly is more cognizant of some of the concerns and issues that could come up with those types of modifications. And so for that reason, I think I would ask for considering revising those changes to maybe still reference effective clauses, but keep in a generalized reference to modifications. I think with the other changes in the AO, special limitations would still be prohibited. And similarly, for the change proposed in 2103-160E7, I think I would still be interested in seeing a reference to mitigating impacts and just striking through stipulations. And I think that's consistent with criteria 6 in the approval criteria, which also references mitigations. And so I guess either considering keeping the reference to mitigations in 7, or just looking more holistically at the approval criteria and making sure they're all consistent with how they address mitigations. So those are, I guess I'll vote no for the amendment for what it's worth, but those are the concerns that I have.
Commissioner Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with prior commissioner's comments. I would look to vote no to the motion to amend that's currently on the table, and request the previous commissioner put forward a revised amendment. That's where I'm at with it.
Commissioner Strike, would you like to amend your motion based on this?
Well,
Or do we want to just call the vote?
we can call the vote, but again, my intent was that if we didn't make any motion to amend, none of the staff's recommendations were going to make it in to our recommendation as the motion was originally written.
I believe Commissioner Ron's intent, and he did state this, that in his speaking to the motion, he did intend to include the recommendations.
Which is what my motion did, and then we're going to vote. Now all the discussion's been, but except for different points. My point was, I'm willing to withdraw the motion. We can start it all over again. But my concern was that the original motion lacked any reference to staff recommendations. And it was as written, I think it was very limiting. That's my concern.
I guess I'll just point out that this wasn't actually sent to us. This is here
Right.
as a courtesy. This is the Assembly taking action on Title 21, which they have the right to do. And so I'm not real concerned, other than that our voices are heard, the findings are on the record. That's me personally, that's kind of my take on it.
Then I'm willing to withdraw the motion.
Okay. Commissioner Strike withdraws the motion. We are back to the main motion. Anyone wishing to speak to the main motion? Commissioner Gardner.
I'll just note briefly, just for clarification, I support the general intent of removing a confusing an element of code, and I just would ask that, in the manner the department thinks most effective, that my prior comments, make it into whatever information ultimately makes it to the Assembly.
Commissioner George.
Thank you, through the chair. I want to acknowledge the chair for making space on our agenda, for allowing us to hear this item, which was not sent to us. This is a very unusual situation where we are hearing an item that's not been referred to us, and we're consuming municipal staff and commissioner time and resources. So I commend you and appreciate the tremendous latitude you have allowed this commission to take this evening and previously on this item. I don't want to overlook that. Many of the points that I've already made, I still stand by. I think for me, it comes down to merely the powers of the commission and our ability to effectively convey and encapsulate, the public hearings that we have before us, the people that come before us, the input. The Assembly doesn't have the time to do all of these actions, otherwise they wouldn't have a Planning and Zoning Commission. And so they have seated a commission comprised of ourselves to hear these cases and to make recommendations to the Assembly. I love having the ability and the flexibility of this item in our toolbox. The Assembly's not removing their ability to have this power before them. They could, all they're doing essentially is they're telling us not to tell them to put a special limitation on something. And I don't think that that is in furtherance of good government. And for that reason alone, I would oppose this. Thank you.
I see nobody else in the queue, so before we call the vote, I intend to support the motion. I just want to restate that this does not remove existing SLs. I think Title 21 requirements are robust, and with conditions of approval and the other tools, I think we have the guardrails needed to promote responsible development. And then just restate that ultimately P&Z does not enact any zoning but recommends to the Assembly. The Assembly will still retain the ability to create special zoning if it chose to. And P&Z can deny zoning and in its findings indicate that one special thing may or may not have made it pass. So I really don't think we're losing much, and then just the massive consequences of outdated special SLs that I've seen and heard about. It seems okay for me to try changing it, try life without it, and we've definitely rolled the dice on Title 21 before, so I'm okay with it. Commissioner Ron.
Thank you, Chair. Just to close out my commentary and underscoring the comments from the prior commissioner about retaining language around approval with modifications. It seems like it's not the will of this commission to amend the motion. It looks like it's going to carry or not as it's currently stated, but again, underscoring that, that element of flexibility. Thank you.
Seeing no one else in the queue, we'll call for the vote.
Mr. Winchester, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you.
That motion passes. Now we will move on to Section J, Title 21 discussion. Number 1, AO 2024-102, changes to the B3 district. Take it away, staff.
Through the chair, we have not prepared a presentation on either of these items tonight. This is, again, a special circumstance where Planning and Zoning Commission hearing was waived on these items by the Assembly, and we are bringing them to you. And you may take action on them if you would like to, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to discuss.
Thank you. Commissioner Gardner.
Thank you. I guess just a question. It seems like, having looked through these, I appreciate, as always, kind of the staff's input and consideration and the experience it brings to reviewing these. The information that's in these packets, including kind of the recommendations to bring some of these through the Planning and Zoning Commission, how or in what way would that make it to the Assembly?
Through the chair, yeah, this is sort of uncharted waters of how this goes. So I think our plan is to take what we hear tonight, whether there's action or not, but at least go to the recording and sort of try to synthesize that and summarize that and bring that to the Assembly.
And I guess I ask in part, is there a mechanism that is available to us that would be helpful to kind of put a fine point on it, like in terms of, I don't know, like a resolution or something? I mean, I'd be interested to just say, please take a look at this, from the Planning and Zoning Commission, if that's a way to do that.
This happened a while back when I first got on the commission, and what we did is we passed a resolution. If we determined that there was something that we felt important enough as a body to send along, we passed a resolution stating that, and it was as simple as that. So,
Through the chair, if I may, this is not under an action item. It was not noticed as an action item. What I would suggest is asking staff to draft a memorandum with your suggestions or requests. Thank you.
I stand corrected. We can send a memorandum. Commissioner Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question to you, if you're fit for answering. If not, then perhaps party response. Could our action include a direct request in the form of a resolution that this come before the Planning and Zoning Commission to enable public hearing process?
I don't see why we couldn't put that in the memo to say we wish you would send this to us. Just to kind of speak to that idea, personally, I guess I kind of take a little different stance than most. Like if I feel strongly enough about a Title 21 issue that's going before the Assembly, I will submit written comments and possibly testify at the public hearing at the assembly. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to request that it come before us personally, because if I felt strongly enough about it, I would go there and make comments myself. That's just me, like kind of my personal 2 cents on it.
Through the chair, one addition, you could have it come before the PCC, but when you testify before the assembly, it's as an individual. You would not do it
Yeah.
on behalf of PCC.
No, I don't, yeah, I don't pretend to represent
Yeah.
all of you
could go
when
in
I
as
say
an
things.
individual. Yeah. As long as you state that, you can go as an individual and nail them to the wall.
We're positive, like, the assemblies put out the public notices required and stuff, because that's what we keep hearing, is nobody's, been informed of all this. They don't have enough time to react. The assembly's meeting all their time requirements, right? I mean, that's the argument I want to have, but I feel like if they're meeting their requirements, it's pretty hard to argue that, so. Are we positive they're meeting their 21-day notice on this specific case?
Through the chair, from what I understand, the assembly has met all of their legal requirements for noticing on these.
I mean, my personal experience is that people miss things and then kind of say, oh, there's not enough notice here. And it's similar to, last meeting, we had people saying that the 500 feet, noticing all owners within 500 feet isn't enough, and that our process is broken. And I mean, as a developer, I would say that, I'm not looking to increase the burden. I think the 2014 version of Title 21, or the current version of Title 21, has increased the burden quite a bit, and we've been hearing that a lot lately. Commissioner Ron.
Yeah, because the 500 feet could be 2,000.
Thank you. Through the chair, I guess question of staff. On page 2, does the department intend to include language either as it exists or similar to it, such that staff recommends the assembly extend the period for public review and consider an additional opportunity for the public to review the materials via the Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing process? To repeat the question, will that be in the memo that goes to the assembly? Or is it intended to include that language?
Through the chair, that could absolutely be in the memo that we would send to the assembly on tonight, and that's something we would include, sort of passing that along. And
So
in the
staff
existing,
recommend that it should be in the memo or not?
Commissioner Ron, can I just clarify, we're talking about the changes to the B3, is that correct?
Title page subject, information on AO 2024-102, changes to the B3 district. Are we on the same page?
Okay, yep. I just wanted to make sure.
I'm tracking.
if I may, through the chair, on page 2, we said, staff recommends the assembly extend the period for public review and consider an additional opportunity for the public to review the materials via the Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing process. And I think that was on B3. I think in the other one, we recommended a working group. So in both, we did recommend getting additional eyes on both of these items. But we'll be glad to pass along that members of the commission also emphasize that that'd be important to them.
Question. Based on that comment on page 2, top paragraph, if this body does nothing, is it the intent of the Planning and Zoning Office to send that recommendation to the assembly regardless?
Yes, this memo was written with the intent that it would be part of the information sent to the assembly. prior-
from your office,
From our office?
not necessarily from this commission.
Correct.
But if the commission agrees with that motion and gives its tacit approval here this evening, you would just incorporate P and Z Commission as party to that memo?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we want to do anything? Now's the time.
It wouldn't be a motion, it would just be a direct,
I guess it won't be a motion, it would be,
just a direct staff to. You can if you want.
I mean, so what if we don't all agree on what we want to do?
Except too direct.
I guess, our hands are really tied here, so I think if you feel strongly about this, you should write the assembly. But Commissioner Gardner, go ahead.
No, I don't see any reason why we couldn't do a motion to have something that reflects,
That's fine.
the intent of the body. So I'll just move, whether anyone will go along with it or not, but
I
to,
see it on your screen, I don't know if that'll help, but what do you want to add to it?
I guess to direct the planning staff to draft a memo that incorporates, the materials they've already put together on both of these items, and also include information that the Planning and Zoning Commission agrees with the recommendation with respect to AO 2024-102, to consider additional opportunity for the public to review the materials via the Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing process. That's my motion.
Okay, wait.
I can't restate that.
So look at what I got and fill it in, please.
Yeah, I would just finish off the recommendation of considering additional opportunity for the public to review via the PZC hearing process.
I'm not there yet. I'm sorry, with the recommendation of what?
With the recommendation of planning staff.
That's it? Oh, wait.
Which part are we looking at?
Okay, so what is on the screen? So what am I putting? Consider, staff recommends this.
Recommendations of planning staff.
Planning staff, that the assembly extend the period.
And extend the period of public review and consider an additional opportunity.
Okay, wait a minute, quit reading, I'm typing.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry.
But you know where it's at.
Just, you don't want this in there? This doesn't go in there, or does this go in there?
Agrees with the recommendation of planning staff to consider.
Consider, and you don't want this in there? or you do?
All of it. He was trying to underline.
Consider,
So from right,
oh, okay.
because I was,
Am I?
yeah, I was looking at what's here, not what you had already. Once you get that, I think we can delete the line right before it.
Okay, so, should be on your screen. Draft a memorandum to the Assembly that incorporates material and information that the PZ agrees.
Okay, Commissioner Gardner, we have a motion on the table, seconded by Commissioner Braun. Would you like to speak to the motion? Or state, and I think it's
Yeah,
good.
I'll just speaking briefly to it, I think there's a lot that goes into this proposed ordinance, and I think we have an opportunity to provide some information that could be useful to the Assembly to kind of work through some of those specifics as a body, take fact-finding, and help distill some of that into a recommendation that would ideally lead to a better outcome.
Commissioner Strike.
Yeah, the public process is important, and whether it's minimal or not, but the process itself. So, and I support the move that this commission presents and supports the staff to see more public involvement, especially when we see changes of this type that reach this magnitude. We have comments that come from the public. We have comments that come from the city council, the different council groups, neighborhood councils, et cetera, that I think are invaluable for us to hear when this type of piece comes. So I support the motion.
Commissioner George.
Thank you to the chair. I'm not quite sure what I'm potentially voting for or against. The first half says to have the staff draft a memo to the Assembly that incorporates material. So what material are we incorporating? The staff recommendations?
The two memos that we have.
So we're incorporating memos that are already going to the Assembly.
Well, these ones are addressed to us, but we're just confirming that they will go to the Assembly.
So we're forwarding the memos to the Assembly, but we can't take a stance for or against them or opine on whether they are correct or whether we support the underlying items, because that would require a public hearing, correct?
I believe Commissioner Gardner can speak to this, but the intent was like, we support this, and then we highlighted one section which was consider extending the public process by adding public hearing at Planning and Zoning Commission.
So my understanding is the intent is just to confirm that this information makes it to the Assembly as part of the memo, and that memo includes our request to support specifically the proposal to include, go through the Planning and Zoning hearing process.
Thank you, Commissioner. With that understanding that this is merely forwarding this item and stating the Commission's desire to see this additional input, with it being limited to those items, I would be comfortable supporting the motion. Thank you.
I do not intend to support the motion. I've heard from several people in the multi-housing industry that they need these changes sooner than later, and that's why I believe the Assembly has taken them up. And so therefore, I will not be voting to support the recommendation to extend the public hearing longer. And seeing no one else, we can call for the vote.
Mr. Winchester, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, that motion passes. Now we're moving on to item number 2. The establishing a moratorium on residential design standards. What do we want to do on this one? Daniel McKenna Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We just wanted to note that there was an S version introduced on the moratorium on residential design standards 2024. 104, is that right? That was at the December 3rd meeting, I think. So that, I think, expands the scope of this. So just as for information.
Commissioner Ron.
Thank you. The chair, clarification requested from staff. The last sentence, first page under overview, acknowledging this is not a public hearing item and the planning department will not be providing a formal staff report to the commission, got it, or the assembly beyond this memorandum. Is that intended to mean that this memorandum will go to the assembly? I'm seeing nods in the positive.
Through the chair, yes, we were planning on sending this to the assembly. In a formal staff report, goes through the criteria, goes through the formal process, and it looks at all that stuff. And so, again, because we're sort of in uncharted waters again, this would be, we'll provide this. And anything from tonight, of course, as well. At this point, I think our role is to sort of just transmit the information.
Commissioner Gardner.
So just to clarify kind of where we are on this, I know for myself, I don't have any particular points of emphasis that I'd be interested in making, just along, I am interested in making sure that this goes forward to the assembly. It sounds like it will. So if we're all kind of that mind, then there's no motion that's required, correct? Rather, I guess if someone does have a point of emphasis, then they could or should make a motion.
I would be surprised if you didn't want to request that the assembly extend the public process by adding a planning and zoning meeting like you did on the last one. But I didn't support that one either, so happy to let this die. Alrighty, well, if nobody has anything else on item J2, we can move on to commissioner comments. Looks like people are reading and thinking down here. I don't want to rush them. All right, or we can move to adjourn. Moved by Strike, seconded by Gardner. Hearing no objections, we are adjourned, and I am really sorry that I completely forgot what time it was. and night it was. I was just so distracted by the weather. I was definitely not watching a football game.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Have a good night.